Welcome to the course, everyone. These lectures provide an overview of the chapters. This material is meant to supplement your careful reading and studying of the assigned chapters. The science of human development seeks to understand how and why people, all kinds of people, everywhere, of every age, change or remain the same over time. Developmental psychologists recognize that growth is multidirectional, multi-contextual, multicultural, and plastic. These terms are explained in this chapter, but first we need to delve deeper into the elements of the basic definition of developmental science, the how and why of lifespan development. Then we move on to the next section of the chapter, covering the major theories of human development. And we conclude with the research strategies used to study change over time. Lifespan development explores how we change and grow from conception to death. This field of psychology is studied by developmental psychologists. They view development as a lifelong process that can be studied scientifically. There are 5 basic steps of the scientific method. We begin with curiosity. On the basis of theory, prior research, or a personal observation, we pose a question. Then we develop a hypothesis, a specific prediction that can be tested. We then test the hypothesis by designing and conducting research to gather empirical evidence or data. We need to decide how to measure the topic or behavior of interest. We then draw conclusions. We use the evidence or data to support or refute the hypothesis. Finally, we report the results. We share the data and conclusions, as well as an alternative explanation. Think about a particular feature that you have, such as intelligence, good looks, or a friendly, outgoing personality. Did you inherit it from your parents? Or is it mainly because of where and how you were brought up? Answers to the questions illustrate different positions on the nature-nurture issue, which involves the degree to which genetic or hereditary influences and experiential or environmental influences determine the kind of person you are. Nature refers to the influence of the genes we inherit. Nurture refers to environmental influences that affect development. Now, related to the nature-nurture question is a term called epigenetics, which is how environmental factors affect genes and genetic expression. Differential susceptibility refers to how environmental experiences differ because of particular inherited genes. Differential susceptibility is based on evolutionary theory and refers to how people differ in their degree of environmental sensitivity. Some are generally more and some generally less sensitive to the effects of both negative and positive environmental experiences. For example, people who possess one variety of a gene related to the neurotransmitter serotonin are more prone to depression than people who possess a different variety of the same gene, but only after experiencing significant life stresses. The differential susceptibility model basically says that some children have temperaments that have plasticity, meaning they are more affected by their environment, such as parenting, and other children have fixed temperaments, which are not as affected by their environment. So when each group is subjected to the same negative or positive environment, the plastic individual's behavior is dependent on it, while the fixed individual's behavior is not, and is the same, regardless of the environment. Developmentalists divide the lifespan into periods, but these age ranges do not strictly apply to all children and adults. As you will learn, developmentalists are reluctant to specify chronological ages for any period of development, since time is only one of many variables that affect each person. However, age is a crucial variable, and development can be segmented into periods of study. Approximate ages for each period are given here. Although children develop at slightly different rates, we can use age-related averages as general guidelines to compare children with same-age peers to determine the approximate ages they should reach specific normative events called developmental milestones. With the lifespan perspective, we see that development is multi-directional. Over time, human characteristics change in every direction. Several major theorists describe discontinuous stages of development: Freud, Erikson, and Piaget. Others view development as a continuous process. There is simple growth, radical transformation, improvement, and decline, as well as stability, stages, and continuity, day to day, year to year, and generation to generation. Let's consider continuous versus discontinuous growth. Continuous development views development as a cumulative process, gradually improving on existing skills. With this type of development, there is gradual change. Consider, for example, a child's physical growth, adding inches to height year by year. In contrast, theorists who view development as discontinuous believe that development takes place in unique stages. It occurs at specific times or ages. With this type of development, the change is more sudden, such as an infant's ability to conceive object permanence. The concept of continuous development can be visualized as a smooth slope of progression, whereas discontinuous development sees growth in more discrete stages. Many patterns of development have been discovered by careful research. Although linear progress, as shown by the blue line, seems most common, scientists now find that almost no aspect of human change follows the linear pattern exactly. Windows of heightened plasticity in brain development are called critical and sensitive periods. A critical period is a time when certain things must occur for normal development. It begins and ends abruptly. It is a period beyond which a phenomenon will not appear. Sensitive periods are times when a particular development occurs most easily. Sensitive periods, as pictured by the graph, begin and end gradually. A critical period in brain development is when the brain must have certain environmental stimuli to develop normally. While very few critical periods of brain development have been identified, the period of visual system development is one of them. Scientists have shown that the visual system of the brain requires exposure to light during the first 6 months of life to stimulate the neural connections that allow an infant to see. Instead of critical periods of development, research shows that development is actually most influenced by windows of opportunity. During windows of opportunity, or sensitive periods of time, the brain is primed to learn specific information. For example, the sensitive period for learning to speak a second language, as if it were a first language, occurs from ages 0 to 12. Although we can still learn to speak a second language after age 12, more effort will be required because the brain has lost its natural ability to process and store new language information. You'll note in the graph, the peak of plasticity is staggered throughout development. We've covered how development is multidirectional, but it's also multi-contextual, and we see this in a historical context. A cohort is a group whose members share a significant experience at a certain period of time, or have one or more similar characteristics. A cohort is a collection of people who share an experience or characteristic over time, and is often applied as a method of defining a population for the purposes of research. Examples of cohorts commonly used in developmental research include birth cohorts, a group of people born during the same period of time, like a generation, and educational cohorts, a group of people who begin schooling or an educational program at the same time, like this year's freshman class of college students. Cohorts can also be composed of people who share the same experience, like being incarcerated over the same period of time, experiencing a natural or man-made disaster, or women who have terminated pregnancies during a particular time period. Cohorts can take a variety of forms and serve as useful research tools for studying trends, social change, and impacts of certain experiences and events. As such, studies that employ cohorts are very useful for informing social policy. Most developmentalists agree that environment is an important force in many aspects of development. The ecological systems approach proposes that all aspects of development are interconnected, much like the threads of a spider's web, so that no aspect of development can be isolated from others and understood independently. Each person is affected by many social contexts and interpersonal interactions. Nested levels surround individuals and affect them. And the approach is also referred to as the ecological model. An ecological systems approach would emphasize, for example, that to understand why adolescents behave as they do, we need to consider many different systems that influence them, including parents, teachers, the media, the neighborhood, and social policy. This approach focuses on the complexities of environments and their links to development. The best known advocate of the ecological systems approach was Urie Bronfenbrenner. Here's a look at the ecological model, and here you can see the nested systems which surround individuals. The microsystem includes elements of the person's immediate surroundings, such as family and peer group. The mesosystem consists of the connections among the systems. The exosystem includes local institutions, such as the school. And macrosystems are the larger social settings, including cultural values, economic policies, and political processes. And finally, the chronosystem, which literally means time system, affects the other systems. It includes changing conditions over the lifespan. Each person is affected by interactions among overlapping systems, which provide the context of development. This model shows rather clearly how development is multi-contextual. The lifespan perspective also reveals that development is multicultural. Culture is a system of shared beliefs, norms, behaviors, and expectations that persist over time and prescribe social behavior and assumptions. It involves social constructions, which are based on shared perceptions and not on objective reality. Vygotsky, who we'll discuss shortly, described the interaction between culture and education. Many age-related terms, such as childhood, adolescence, yuppie, and senior citizen, are actually social constructions. The difference equals deficit error also reveals that development is multicultural. Humans tend to believe that they, their nation, and their culture are a little better than others. The belief becomes destructive if it reduces respect and appreciation for others, and the differences may be perceived assets or perceived deficits. Vygotsky lived from 1896 to 1934, when war, starvation, and revolution led to the deaths of millions. Throughout this political turmoil, Vygotsky focused on learning in children and learning within a culture. He described the interaction between culture and education and proposed guided participation is a universal process used by mentors to teach cultural knowledge, skills, and habits. Ethnicity is a social construction affected by social context, not a direct outcome of biology. An ethnic group consists of people whose ancestors were born in the same region and who often share a language, culture, and religion. Race is a group of people regarded as distinct from other groups on the basis of appearance, typically skin color. Social scientists think race is a misleading concept, as biological differences are not signified by outward appearance. It's a social construction that continues to lead to racism. We've covered how development is multidirectional, multi-contextual, multicultural. It's also plastic. Plasticity is basic to a contemporary understanding of human development. It simultaneously incorporates two facts. First, people can change over time, and new behavior depends partly on what has already happened. Plasticity is the idea that personality and other human characteristics or traits are moldable and thus can change. Human traits can be molded, yet people maintain a certain durability. The next section of this lecture looks at theories of human development. A developmental theory is a systematic statement of principles and generalizations. It's a framework for understanding how and why people change as they grow older. Now, there are no truly comprehensive theories of human development to guide researchers. Instead, psychoanalytic theory, behaviorism, learning theory, social learning theory, cognitive theory, and evolutionary theory provide perspectives that influence researchers. We begin with psychoanalytic theory, which proposes that irrational unconscious drives and motives, often originating in childhood, underlie human behavior. Now, Sigmund Freud was the first psychoanalyst. He proposes 5 psychosexual stages, during which sensual satisfaction is linked to developmental needs and conflicts. And there is a table in the text which gives details of each stage. And Freud also suggests that early conflict resolution determines personality patterns. Development in the first 6 years occurs in 3 stages, each characterized by sexual pleasure centered on a particular part of the body. Another theorist is Erik Erikson. He described 8 developmental stages, each characterized by a challenging developmental crisis. He proposed 5 psychosocial stages building on Freud's theory, but added 3 adult stages. He stressed that genes and biological impulses are powerfully influenced by the social environment. In his first 30 years, Erikson never fit into a particular local community, since he frequently changed nations, schools, and professions. Then he met Joan. In their first 5 decades of marriage, they raised a family and wrote several books. Now, one wonders if he had published his theory at age 73, when this photograph was taken, instead of in his 40s, would he still have described life as a series of crises? Learning theory is an aspect of behaviorism. It focuses on observable behavior and describes the laws and processes by which behavior is learned. In contrast to psychoanalytic theory, learning theory focuses on how learning influences a certain behavior. This perspective emphasizes the role of experience, examining whether a person's behavior is rewarded or punished. Now, conditioning is also important in behaviorism. It proposes that learning takes place through processes by which responses become linked to a particular stimuli. John Watson was an early proponent of learning theory. His ideas are still influential today. He stressed that scientists should examine only what they could observe and measure, and proposed anything can be learned with a focus on behavior. Behaviorism gives us an understanding of classical conditioning, which demonstrates that behaviors can be learned by making an association between an environmental stimulus and a naturally occurring stimulus. It's also called respondent conditioning, a process by which a person or animal learns to associate a neutral stimulus with a meaningful stimulus, gradually reacting to the neutral stimulus with the same response as to the meaningful one. A contemporary of Freud, Ivan Pavlov, was a physiologist who received the Nobel Prize in 1904 for his research on digestive processes. It was this line of study that led to his discovery of classical conditioning, when his research on dog saliva led to insights about learning. Operant conditioning is a little bit different because it's a learning process in which a particular action is followed either by something desired or something unwanted, making the action either more or less likely to be repeated. It's also called instrumental conditioning. Now, B.F. Skinner wrote extensively about operant conditioning. He was inspired by Pavlov and was best known for experiments with rats, pigeons, and even his own daughter. I've created this operant conditioning flow chart to refresh your memory. It'll probably take you back to Intro to Psychology. First, you consider what the goal is. If it's to increase the behavior, You want to provide some type of reinforcement. If you want to decrease the behavior, you're going to add a punisher, and that can be something received that is unwanted or something positive that's removed. Another theory of human development is social learning theory. It's an extension of behaviorism that emphasizes that other people influence each person's behavior. It proposes that even without specific reinforcement, every individual learns many things through observation and imitation of other people, also called modeling. Now, Albert Bandura first described social learning theory and emphasized the influence that other people have over a person's behavior. Cognitive theory provides a different perspective on human development. It proposes that thoughts and expectations profoundly affect actions, attitudes, beliefs, and assumptions. It focuses on changes in how people think over time. Jean Piaget maintained that cognitive development occurs in 4 major age-related periods or stages: sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. He stressed that intellectual advancement occurs throughout life because humans seek cognitive equilibrium. I've reproduced this table from the textbook to help you understand Piaget's periods of cognitive development, and I encourage you to study this table. As we progress through the course, we'll be looking more closely at each of these stages. In the sensory motor stage, from birth to 2 years, there's motor activity without the use of symbols. All things are learned based on experiences or trial and error. The goal is object permanence. In the pre-operational stage, from 2 to 6 years, there's the development of language, memory, and imagination, and intelligence is both egocentric and intuitive. In the concrete operational stage, 6 to approximately 11 years, there's a more logical and methodical manipulation of symbols, less egocentric, and the child is more aware of the outside world and events. And in the formal operational period, from 12 years through adulthood, there's the use of symbols to relate to abstract concepts. The individual is able to make hypotheses and grasp abstract concepts and relationships. 2 terms associated with cognitive theory are assimilation and accommodation. Assimilation is where experiences are interpreted to fit into or assimilate with old ideas. Accommodation is where old ideas are restructured to include or accommodate new experiences. A new experience can be jarring and incomprehensible. The resulting experience is one of cognitive disequilibrium, an imbalance that initially creates confusion. Disequilibrium leads to cognitive growth because it forces people to adapt their old concepts. Piaget describes 2 types of adaptation: assimilation and accommodation. For example, a child believes that all furry 4-legged animals are dogs. He sees a breed of dog that he's never seen before and says, "That's a dog." That's assimilation. Then the child sees a raccoon and the child says, "That's a dog." But his parents tell him, "It isn't a dog, it's a raccoon." So the child accommodates. Not all furry 4-legged animals are dogs. Some are raccoons. We'll conclude this section of the lecture by looking at evolutionary theory, which has become more popular in recent years. It suggests that organisms change over time as a result of changes in heritable physical or behavioral traits. Charles Darwin theorized nature works to ensure that each species does 2 things: survive and reproduce. Now we'll look at the scientific method as it is used in research. The method requires scientific observation, which requires researchers to record behavior systematically and objectively. It may be conducted in a naturalistic setting or a laboratory. Experiments are the only scientific method which can establish causal relationships among variables. The variables include the independent variable and the dependent variable. The independent variable is the variable that is introduced to see what effect it has on the dependent variable. The dependent variable is the variable that may change as a result of whatever new condition or situation the experimenter adds. The experimental group gets a particular treatment, the independent variable, and the comparison group, also called a control group, does not get the treatment. Here are some statistical measures that are often used in research analyses. You should become familiar with them as they will come up throughout the textbook and may appear in your own research. There is a table in the textbook explaining these statistics. Some basic research designs you should be familiar with are cross-sectional research, where groups of people of one age are compared with people of another age. Longitudinal research, which involves collecting data repeatedly on the same individuals as they age. And cross-sequential research is studying several groups of people of different ages, a cross-sectional approach, and following them over the years, a longitudinal approach. A caution and challenge is in understanding correlations. A correlation exists between two variables if one variable is more or less likely to occur when the other does. A correlation is positive if both variables tend to increase together or decrease together. A correlation is negative if one variable tends to increase while the other decreases. A correlation is zero if no connection is evident. And this is crucial. Correlation is not causation. Correlation does not imply causation is the logically valid idea that events which coincide with each other are not necessarily caused by each other. The assumption of causation is false when the only evidence available is simple correlation. In a controlled scientific experiment, causation can be teased out of a correlation by removing all possible third variables or confounding variables. And a dramatic example of understanding that correlation is not causation comes from the Centers for Disease Control. The number of Japanese passenger cars sold in the U.S. correlates very highly with suicides by crashing of a motor vehicle. Each academic discipline and professional society involved in the study of human development has a code of ethics. The Institutional Review Board, IRB, is an administrative body established to protect the rights and welfare of human research subjects who are recruited to participate in research activities that are conducted under the auspices of the institution with which it is affiliated. The IRB is charged with the responsibility of reviewing, prior to its initiation, all research, whether funded or not, involving human participants. Now, the Code of Ethics ensures that participation is voluntary, confidential, and harmless. Subjects in the study must participate willingly. Vulnerable populations, such as prisoners, children, and pregnant women, must receive extra protections. The Code of Ethics also ensures that participants understand the research procedures and any risks involved. Informed consent is a voluntary agreement to participate in research. It is not merely a form that is signed, but is a process. Informed consent is essential before enrolling a participant and ongoing once enrolled. And the Code of Ethics also promotes research accuracy, honesty, and truthfulness.